In continuation of the previous part, we move directly into the second part of everything about duels, without any preamble. The second part begins now. In gun duels, there were mainly three methods employed. The most common one was simultaneous fire. It involved two individuals, standing back to back, taking about 10 paces each. And then, upon a signal, they would simultaneously turn and fire their guns at each other. Another frequently used method was taking turns to shoot. They would alternate firing a single shot at a time. The order of shooting could be decided through prior agreement, or by drawing lots at the dueling site. If one party killed the other with the first shot, the duel ended, but if not, the opportunity switched to the other party. There was also a method reminiscent of Russian roulette, where the second placed a single bullet in one of the two guns, and the duelist had to pick the gun. Due to the closer proximity in this method, it had the highest fatality rate among the three. While duels had been publicly conducted for a long time, they were still blatantly illegal. The Catholic Church condemned duels as crimes incited by the devil. Secular rulers in most countries had also issued stern warnings, threatening those who engaged in duels with severe punishments. However, since most duelists came from influential noble families, they often got away with a mere slap on the wrist or a light fine, even in cases where a duelist killed their opponent. If they followed all the widely accepted procedures, they often received lenient treatment. The choice of weapons in duels shifted from swords to guns, as the 18th century gave way to the 19th century. This transition can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, the aristocracy was in a position to easily adapt to advancements in weaponry. Secondly, guns became a symbol of status as they were expensive, and the upper class often carried them as a deliberate display of their wealth. Thirdly, guns were considered a fairer weapon than swords. Swordsmanship required extensive training over a long period, while guns were relatively easier for novices to handle. Lastly, and most importantly, guns had a much lower mortality rate compared to swords. Although we now consider firearms like rifles to be significantly more lethal than swords, that is a contemporary perspective. Dueling pistols of that era, primarily flintlock pistols, had notoriously poor accuracy. Dueling pistols were designed to prioritize ornamentation over performance, with the intent of reducing fatalities in duels. On the other hand, sword duels often resulted in death or serious injury due to the close-quarters nature of the combat. This shift from swords to guns was the primary reason for the decline of dueling. It's worth reiterating that the most crucial aspect of a duel was to display one's honor and courage to others. If someone could maintain this facade, there was no need to jeopardize their life. This often led to the deliberate practice of missing the first shot. In return, the opponent would respond by aiming off target as well, effectively reaching an unspoken agreement that allowed both parties to save face and restore their honor without harm. Duels typically occurred at dawn or in the early evening. Dueling pistols were prone to misfires due to humidity, and in such cases, the duelist often interpreted it as a sign from the heavens to reconcile, thus allowing for intentional draws. These draws were quite common in dueling. Figures like Russia's national poet Pushkin, who dueled over 20 times, or the United States President Andrew Jackson, who dueled over 100 times, did so because of the frequency of these draws. Dueling was, strictly speaking, illegal almost everywhere. To evade attention, duels were usually conducted at dawn. Even with tacit approval, engaging in a duel during broad daylight could result in immediate arrest. Dueling locations were often secluded areas like open fields or riverbanks. Sundays and festival days had to be avoided, and any place within view of a church was off limits. There were no prescribed dress codes, but wealthier duelists often wore silk shirts. Ordinary clothing could easily allow a piece of cloth to penetrate deep into a wound, causing inflammation leading to death. However, it was believed that silk merely tore apart, instead of penetrating the body. Silk garments were, nonetheless, quite expensive, and not all members of the upper class could afford them. Consequently, it was customary to strip down before dueling. Certain groups, like clergy, the elderly, teenagers, women, and the infirm, were not considered targets for duels. However, in exceptional circumstances, they could appoint champions to duel on their behalf. A professional appointed to handle this task was known as a second. Over time, this role lost its honorable connotation and became synonymous with the term winner. Although rare, duels between men and women did occur, but with handicaps. According to records from 12th century Denmark, a man dueled with one arm buried in a hole and could only use a lance. Additionally, in medieval Germany, men were restricted to using one arm, and winning involved dragging the woman into a hole, resulting in her immediate burial. However, women could freely attack their male counterparts. In such cases, the woman was buried in the hole, illustrating the severe consequences of her actions. Sometimes, men had to follow rules, like covering one eye when dueling, as an attempt to balance the duel. While these instances were rare, there were occasions where men and women dueled. In such cases, both genders had the option of using guns or swords. Although it was advised to use non-lethal weapons to avoid endangering lives, weapons like stockings filled with sand were often used. The agreed-upon shooting distance varied, according to the discretion of the seconds. However, the general understanding was that the dueling distance should be at least 10 yards. A yard equated to 9.14 meters, and if you consider the length of an average adult stride to be approximately 60 centimeters, this distance translated to about 15 paces. In practice, though, the dueling distance was typically between 25 to 35 yards. When it came to dueling with swords, combat often occurred within a square area measuring approximately 20 square feet. In addition to dueling simultaneously with firearms, it was quite common for duelists to take turns firing shots in a predetermined sequence. Waiting for the opponent to fire a shot at you, no matter how poor the gun's accuracy might be, was still a nerve-wracking experience. People of that era believed that enduring this fear was the ultimate way to prove their courage. Dueling to demonstrate one's manhood required a duelist to stand erect, without flinching or moving when facing the opponent's gun. Avoiding an opponent's bullet was deemed cowardly. Such actions brought disgrace not only to the duelists themselves, but also to their seconds, who were viewed negatively. Duelists who fired their guns in anger were not subject to blame. However, dodging a bullet was seen as a dishonorable act, resulting in the person's honor plummeting and them living as a coward for the rest of their life. In practice, moving one's body to avoid an inaccurate bullet was unwise. Such a maneuver could lead to an even more imprecise bullet hitting you. In some cases, the fear was too overwhelming, and someone fired their gun before the countdown ended. This was considered the worst-case scenario, and it could lead to the seconds engaging in a fight and causing multiple fatalities. To prevent this, some areas implemented a ban on seconds carrying firearms, and individuals who committed fouls were later arrested and sentenced to execution for murder. In cases where duelists did not wish to harm or injure their opponents, they might intentionally shoot their guns into the air. Although it might seem like a peaceful act, it could still be seen as a profound insult to the opponent. This act could rob the opponent of a genuine opportunity to restore their honor, as shooting an opponent who aimed off target could be viewed as unsportsmanlike behavior. Shooting an opponent in midair to deliver an accurate shot was often condemned as an ungentlemanly act. When duelists wished to avoid causing harm to their opponents, they would aim slightly off target to ensure that they only grazed their opponent. This allowed both parties to preserve their pride and honor without causing harm. It's difficult to ascertain the exact numbers, but when dueling with swords, the mortality rate could range from 20 to as high as 60. This means that, even if the opponent did not die immediately, they often succumbed to infection or sepsis after the duel. With gun dueling, the mortality rate was significantly lower, estimated at around 5%. The number of individuals killed in duels is hard to determine. Records from early 17th century France, however, suggest that more than 200 individuals died in duels each year. These figures alone reveal the prevalence of dueling in Europe during that period. Western duel culture entirely disappeared during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The primary reason for this was a growing perception that dueling was no longer a justifiable means to resolve disputes. People increasingly opted for victory over honor. As the performance of firearms improved, so did the risk of fatal injury in a duel. In the face of rampant falls in dueling, the belief that God would grant victory to the just lost its appeal. Moreover, the introduction of defamation and libel laws, particularly in Germany, meant there was less reason to engage in duels. For emerging upper-middle-class groups, business stability held greater value than honor. As private dueling was viewed as a significant challenge to state jurisdiction, penalties were enhanced. The outbreak of World War I and World War II during the early 20th century further diminished the appeal of duels. Dueling during wartime became absurd, and as people lost their lives on the battlefield, the intrinsic value of human life expanded, leading to a gradual decline in the practice of dueling. Consequently, this centuries-old tradition began to fade from the real world. Thank you for watching.